Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. I have a special video for you here today, as well as a bit of a confession, and that is that I'm a primary Mac user. In fact, back in 2003, I switched over, so it's been about 20 years that I've been using Apple and Mac products as my primary means of using computers. Now, I do have a background in Windows PCs back in like the late 90s and early 2000s. I went to a vocational school and learned how to build them and stuff, but this is like way back in the day, back in like the 40 megabyte hard drive days. But I did use those skills to build my own computer back in like late 2019, right before the pandemic. So I do have a gaming computer, and obviously I test a lot of mini PCs, and so I'm kind of mixing between the two at this point. Yes, I still use Mac for my primary needs. For example, all my video editing is done on a Mac, but I do most of my work on a Windows PC at this point. Now, coincidentally, I often get a lot of questions about what it's like to game on some of these new Macs. You know, they have the M1 chip and the M2 chip now. And so a lot of people had asked me about that, not knowing that I'm like a Mac guy, but just kind of asking if I would check it out. And honestly, I'd never really thought about it because, as we all know, Macs aren't really that great for gaming. However, I've seen a little bit of news here and there that certain emulators are now working on Macs, especially the ARM-based ones that they have now. And so I thought it was time to kind of jump in. And so I actually went and I bought a new Mac Mini. This is the M2 version. This is the $600 model, so the very cheapest one you can get. But honestly, $600 for a mini PC is really not that bad. I test a lot of them that are much more expensive than this. And so that's what we're going to discuss here in this video. I am going to look at PC gaming, for example, via Steam on a Mac, but then also I want to look at emulation, and we'll spend most of our time there. We'll look at which emulators work well and how well they work, and then also we'll see if we can get some sort of front end working so you can have a kind of game-like experience. I think this is a really interesting concept because if you happen to have an M1 or M2 Mac, you're already going to have a very nice gaming PC, at least for emulation, right here. And if you're thinking about getting a computer dedicated for emulation, and you're also curious about some of the things you can do in Mac OS, this might be a really great fit too. And I'm pretty excited to make this video because it's a mixture of my two favorite worlds. You know, we have my everyday Mac use over the past 20 years, but then all the retro game emulation that I love to test as well. And I think you'll get a lot out of this video too. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and jump right in. Okay, let's start by talking about pricing. Like I mentioned before, I bought the cheapest model, the $599 one right here. However, you might be able to get it cheaper. For example, if you are a veteran or currently in the military, you can get 10% off, so you can get it for $540. Or if you're going to college or have a child who's in college, you can actually get it for $100 off. Now on the far right tier, we have the new M2 Pro chip. And that's going to give you a lot more performance, but it is also over twice the price of the low-end model. And so I don't think it's a good fit for our specific use case in this video here, which is to focus on game emulation. But if you're going to be doing something a lot more heavyweight, you know, video editing, things like that, it might be worth considering. Now the middle tier here is an additional $200 over the base price. And at least in a cursory glance right here, the only spec upgrade seems to be the storage. And for me personally, I do not think that 256 gigs is going to be worth an additional $200. Instead, I would recommend getting a USB-C solid state drive like this one right here. It's 2 terabytes and currently on sale for $140. And because the Mac Mini has Thunderbolt 4, you'll be able to plug this right in and have very fast read and write speeds. In fact, this is my primary way of storing my emulated games. As you can see right here, I have the same portable drive and it's filled up with all of my emulated ROMs. So for this video here, I'm just going to plug this in and then direct all my emulators to launch it directly from this drive. Now another accessory for your consideration is going to be a controller. Honestly, I think the best all-around controller for using on a Mac is going to be the recent Xbox Series controllers. These have really nice inputs and the pricing on them are not bad. For example, right now it's on sale for $45. Now if you're really going to be focusing on retro or classic gaming, then you might want to consider something like the SN30 Pro. This is a new transparent purple model I just got in the mail the other day, and this controller has a specific Mac OS setting so it'll work just fine. One thing to bear in mind is that the triggers here are not analog, so if you're going to be playing some more modern games or GameCube games that require that analog input, this isn't going to provide it. So this controller would be great for retro gaming, but I honestly think the Xbox one's just going to be a little bit better all around, especially because the Mac is capable of playing a lot of modern systems, as we'll see here in a minute. Before we get to that, let's talk about what you'll find in the box. Obviously, you'll have the computer, and then inside there's a quick start guide and a sticker as well. Other than that, it just comes with one single power cable. Let's take a look at the back. We have our power button as well as the power input for that cable, and then we have a gigabit Ethernet port right here. On the bottom here, we have a cooling fan, and then above that, we have two Thunderbolt 4 ports. In addition, we have an HDMI port capable of 4K at 60 Hz. And then finally, on the right, we have a headphone jack as well as two USB-A ports, and honestly, that is it. If you look around the sides, we have no other I/O other than one small LED here on the front, which will turn white when turned on. In terms of sizing, the Mac Mini has gotten a little bit wider over the years. As you can see here, it's about the size of 6 sticks of Kerrygold butter. To give you a more practical look, you can see that it's quite a bit bigger than an Xbox controller, but honestly, when you have it sitting on a desk or maybe in an entertainment center, it's going to blend right in. In the end, I wouldn't say it's the smallest mini PC in the world, but I actually like how low profile it is here. It just kind of feels a little bit nondescript. And additionally, this thing is basically silent. In fact, in all of my testing here, I never once heard a fan kick on at all. So next I want to talk about the setup process. We're not going to go too far in the weeds, but I do want to give a couple tips and tricks. Number one, when you first start it up, you're going to have a bunch of stuff here on the bottom. This is called the dock. And these essentially are just shortcuts to the apps that are stored in your applications folder. And many of these you may not need at all. What I recommend doing here is right-clicking on it, going to Options, and then select Remove from Dock. This isn't going to uninstall the app in any way, it's just going to remove it from the dock so you don't have to see it if you don't need it. So this is always one of the very first things I do with a new Mac, is just kind of clean it up so it's just not so cluttered. And I'll show you how to add some of your favorite apps to the dock here in a minute. Now before we get into emulation, I do want to talk a little bit about PC gaming on a Mac. And for this, we'll use Steam as an example. And the Steam client for Mac is basically the same thing as it is on Windows. If you look on the left side, you can see that I have 9 games installed already, and you can also see that I have a library of 271 total Steam games. Now that includes Windows and Mac games, but if you click on this little Apple icon here on the top, it'll actually filter out all the games that are not going to play on a Mac. And as you can see here, between the 271 games I have, there's 72 that are actually compatible with the Mac. And if you look through the games list, you can see that it's mostly lightweight or indie games. It's very rare that you'll find a AAA game that's going to work well. The exceptions to this are going to be like the LEGO games. Many of these will work on a Mac. And there's a couple others like Metro Exodus or Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor, as well as the Tomb Raider series. Now, if you want to have something that's a little bit controller friendly, you can use Big Picture mode. But be aware here that they haven't moved over to the SteamOS style of Big Picture. It's going to be the old school one that we remember from last year and beyond. Either way, if you do want to navigate through Steam with a controller, you can use Big Picture and it'll work just fine. When it comes to gaming, all the games that I installed worked really well, especially when it came to those lightweight games. I just played them at a native 1080p on the default settings, and they all had no stutter or anything. And the AAA games that are supported, at least the ones I tested, did work out pretty well. For example, here's Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and it's running at a stable 60 frames per second with 1080p in medium settings. And honestly, for a mini PC at the $600 price point, playing this game at 1080p medium is really not that bad. The main issue here is that you're just not going to have a lot of games to choose from. Now, if you are interested in doing PC gaming with a Mac, what I would recommend before even thinking about getting a Mac is to go onto the Steam website, and then under Categories, there's an option here for Mac OS. And this will give you a listing of all the games that are going to be compatible with a Mac. But I have to say, don't get your hopes up, because the selection here is very bare bones. The way I see it, if you want to play PC games, then a Mac is not a very good option at all. For example, spending the same amount of money on building a PC or a mini PC will give you access to thousands of games not available here on a Mac. But of course, that's not really the point of this video here. Now let's move into emulation, because this is where it's really going to shine. Now, before we get into the heavyweight stuff, let's talk a little bit about OpenEmu. This is one of the first emulators that were available on the Mac. In fact, I remember playing it maybe 5-6 years ago. And this one's very simple. You can take some ROMs and drag and drop them into the app and then just load them from there. And it'll make the whole experience nice and pretty. You can map your controller, all that stuff. However, this one really only works well with like 16-bit systems, things like maybe even Nintendo 64 and a little bit of GameCube too. And so I'm not really going to focus too much on OpenEmu. I'll have it linked in a written guide that I'll be making for this video, which will be in the video description. But as it stands, if you just want to play some old classics, like you want to jump into some old Pokemon games, this will work out just fine. But for the rest of the video, I want to talk about some of the more capable emulators and really push the performance on this M2 chip. To start, for classic systems, basically everything all the way up to PSP, I'm going to use RetroArch. And to get this set up is actually very easy as well. You just want to go into the RetroArch webpage, go into the download section, then find the macOS one, and then download it from there. And let me show you some of the other emulators I'm going to download for this video. Next up is going to be Dolphin. This one's a GameCube and Nintendo Wii emulator, also compatible with Mac. You've got a couple options here between the beta and development versions. I like to live on the edge, so I'm going to get the development one because that one's updated just basically every day. Moving forward, for Nintendo Wii U emulation, we're going to use the Cemu emulator. This one you have to grab off of GitHub under their experimental page. I'll have all this linked in that written guide down below. Either way, just grab this DMG file, which is the Mac install file right here. And then finally, rounding out our Nintendo systems, we're going to use Ryujinx. And this is actually my first time using this app right here. I usually use Yuzu, but I wasn't able to find a good Mac build for that one. Moving over to our Sony systems, we have PCSX2 for PS2 emulation. For this, I recommend downloading the latest nightly build. Following that, we have RPCS3 for PlayStation 3. This one also has a macOS build. And bear in mind, you'll have to download the latest PS3 firmware as well. You can get this on the Sony website, again linked below. And then finally, we're going to try out the Xemu or Xbox emulator here, also available for Mac. Now, once you've downloaded all these files, you need to start installing them, and the process here is pretty easy too. For most of these, all you have to do is just double-click on the DMG file. It'll show you the app file itself. Then often it gives you a shortcut to the applications folder. All you have to do is just drag and drop the app into the applications folder. And that's how you install an app on a Mac. From there, you can go into your applications folder and then start up the app itself. And if you wanted to uninstall it, all you do is just delete it out of this folder here. Depending on the app, it might ask for some permissions. Just go ahead and accept them. But after that, here we are. We're in the RetroArch system. Now, to add an app to your dock, what you want to do is move it over from the recent section on the right over into the central part of your dock. And it's just a drag and drop right here, but that's essentially going to save it on your dock for easy access later. Now, I'm not going to go through an entire RetroArch setup because I've already made a guide for that, and I'll have that linked down below as well. Either way, this is what it looks like here after I have it set up and I've imported some of my systems. And all I have to do here is just navigate to the game, then select Run, and it'll boot right up. Now, a couple notes I want to give about RetroArch while we're here is that if you need to access anything within the RetroArch folder, it's actually going to be available within your Documents folder. Within here, you'll be able to access things like your saves and save states if you need to pull them out or add some others. And if you need to get any deeper into the RetroArch system, what you want to do is go to the menu bar while in Finder, and then click on Go and then Library. If you don't see Library as an available path right here, what you want to do is press the Option key on your keyboard to bring that up. Either way, go into Library and then go into Application Support and then RetroArch. Here you're going to find the really heavy stuff. So for example, your configuration files in case you mess something up, and also your controller remap files if you need to reset those controller settings too. Either way, those are the two places to look if you need to get into the RetroArch settings. Okay, a couple other tips as you start to install these emulators. When you try to open up Dolphin, it's going to give you this authorization thing, but then it's also going to ask for permission to receive keystrokes, and this is to be able to use a controller with it. What you want to do when this window pops up is just open up System Settings, and then under this heading right here, just go ahead and turn on Dolphin. It'll prompt you for the same password that you used when you first set up your Mac, and then you'll have to quit and reopen the app, but after that you're good to go. It'll never ask for this again. Now for other emulators, it may give you different prompts. For example, when you open up Cemu for the first time, it may prompt you to install Rosetta. And Rosetta is a translation layer between the old Intel-based Macs and the new Apple Silicon ones like this one. Now in some of these apps, like Cemu, after you try to actually open it up, it'll give you a prompt to say that it's not a supported developer. And it'll give you the option to either delete the app or just to cancel out of it. What you want to do here is actually just cancel out of it. From there, go into your system settings, and then under privacy and security, just scroll down to near the bottom. Within here, it's going to show you the last app you tried to open, which is Cemu for us, and that it was blocked. Here you want to select open anyway. It'll again prompt you for your password, but after that you're good to go. You won't have to do this any other time for at least the Cemu app. It's a little bit of an annoying process just to get it started up that very first time, but after that it's going to be good to go. Now in terms of setting up each of these individual emulators, I don't want to turn this into a full-blown tutorial, and so I'm not going to talk you through how to set up your title keys and all the other kind of stuff. Instead, in my written guide, I'll give you instructions or at least links to the quick start guide for each of these emulators. And depending on the emulator, it might take a couple minutes just to get it set up initially. For example, with PlayStation 3, if you remember, we had to download that firmware file. What we can do now is go into File and Install Firmware, and then we'll access our Downloads folder here, and then we'll grab that PS3 firmware file. From there, it'll install the firmware, and then it's going to load up the compiled PPU modules. After that, you're good to go. You don't have to do that ever again. And so in the end, this is what it's going to look like when we have everything set up. I have my Steam on the far left and then all my emulators running across the bottom here. In the end, I think it probably took me maybe 15 minutes altogether to find and download and install each of these apps, and then maybe another half hour just to get them configured that very first time. So overall, I would say it was a relatively painless experience, at least for me, having some knowledge of these emulators ahead of time. And now that we have everything set up, let's go ahead and do some testing and actually see how this will perform when playing these games. We're going to start with RetroArch for all of these classic systems. So I'm going to navigate through my playlist right here. I can then pick a game and then load it right up. We're going to start with the more lightweight systems and move our way up from there. And as expected, your classic systems are going to play just fine. Things like Game Boy Advance or Nintendo or Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, all of these are going to run really well. In fact, you've got so much headroom here when it comes to the overall CPU performance that you can apply basically any shader you can think of. And so if you really want to get into the weeds with RetroArch and classic gaming, you can definitely do that here on the Mac Mini. And it's going to work well for other systems. For example, here with Amiga, all these games are playing at full speed. And it does a really good job with arcade emulation too. Not just your classic systems like this, but you can play everything up through the mid to late 90s. For example, here's Killer Instinct running at full speed, absolutely no problems here. Moving on to some of the more graphically intense home console systems, things like Sony PlayStation will work just fine. In fact, here I'm upscaling it to a 5x resolution, which is 1080p, and yeah, it's running like a dream. Now, Nintendo 64 was a bit of a weird one. For this one specifically, it wouldn't work when I tried to upscale it. In fact, it would actually crash and cause all sorts of issues. And so my recommendation here is just to play it at the original resolution of the Nintendo 64, but even then these games are going to play just fine. Moving forward, here is Sega Saturn. I'm using the Beetle core, which is the most accurate core, and I'm running it at a native resolution. And these games are running really well and look nice and sharp too. I was getting some horizontal lines here with Fighting Vipers. I'm not really sure if this is part of the game or just an issue with the emulator core itself, but regardless, every Saturn game I tried ran at full speed, absolutely no issue here. Moving up to Dreamcast, again we're still here on RetroArch, but I've upscaled this to 1080p, and as you can see, yeah, it's running great. In fact, if you like, you can turn on the widescreen hacks and play games in a full 16:9 like here with Dead or Alive 2. And it'll be the same story with other games that do have widescreen support like Sword of the Berserk. Moving over to handheld systems, Nintendo DS emulation was not the best on RetroArch. And really that has to do with the Nintendo DS emulators in RetroArch, they're just not very efficient. And so the best performance I got here was a 2x resolution, and it ran pretty well, but again, it's not going to be able to upscale to like 1080p. Now the other handheld system, which is Sony PSP, runs like a dream here on the Mac Mini. In fact, I'm able to run it at a 4K upscale resolution, and yeah, absolutely working fine, even with the hardest to run games like God of War Chains of Olympus. So if you're a big PSP fan, there's nothing like playing this thing in 4K, and the Mac Mini does it with no problem here. Okay, so that's RetroArch performance. Let's move over now to the standalone emulators and really start to try to push this thing. We're going to start with Dolphin, and we're going to do GameCube emulation, again at a 6x resolution or 4K, and as you can see, yeah, it is running great here too. I did experience some stutters here and there with certain games when it was compiling shaders. For example, with F-Zero GX, when I first played the first track on a game, then yeah, I ran into a couple issues here and there. But usually by the second lap, everything was nice and smooth, and then anytime after that, if you play that same track, it'll run just fine. It's a very similar experience with Nintendo Wii U. We can also play this at a 4K resolution, but you will get some stutters here and there when you first start playing it. But again, after about maybe 5-10 minutes of use, then it usually gets a lot smoother after that. So really, if anything, don't take those very first impressions as performance of the Mac Mini itself. It really has to do with the way that shaders compile on this specific architecture. In fact, the next emulator, which is the Wii U emulator Cemu, is probably the best example of this phenomenon. When you first start up a game like Breath of the Wild, it's actually going to crawl a lot, and if you look at the very top corner on the left, you can see that it's compiling shaders the entire time. And so in the first like 5-10 minutes that you're playing this game, yeah, it's going to slow down a bunch. But if you look at the top right, you can see that the CPU is not being taxed that much at all. What it comes down to is that most of these emulators cannot do what they call asynchronous shader compilation. What that means is while you're playing the game, it can't compile the shaders at the same time. Instead, it has to kind of pause really quickly, compile the shader, and then move on. And that's why you're experiencing those stutters in the very beginning of the game. But after about 10 minutes of use, you can see here the game's running a lot more smoothly. But again, if we do a new move, something that hasn't been used before, when it compiles those shaders, it is going to get some slowdown. But then watch right here, I'm going to do the exact same move again, and as you can see right here, it does it a lot more smoothly. And so really my suggestion here is give it like an hour when you first play Breath of the Wild for the first time, and then you'll get some smooth gameplay. Let me give you another example right here. Here's Mario Kart 8. I've upscaled this to 4K. And as you can see at the beginning of the race, yeah, it's quite slow here, having some issues. But by the time I'm on the third lap right here, you can see it's not compiling the shaders anymore, and so because of that, it is pretty smooth. Now, I'm not getting a full 60 frames per second in this game, it's hovering around like 50, 55. And so if you want to have it very smooth, then you could maybe drop it down to 1080p instead. And honestly, that's what I did for most of the other games. For example, here with Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, playing it at 1080p worked really well, 60 frames solid. And then same thing with Legend of Zelda Wind Waker HD. This one runs at 30 frames per second by default, but even at the native 1080p resolution, it is looking really, really good. And so I would say that Wii U emulation is one of the highlights of using a Mac Mini like this. In fact, when I first built my gaming PC back in 2019, one of the main reasons for it was to do emulation with Wii U. So it is kind of amazing to see that about 3 years later, we're able to do the exact same performance that I was getting on my desktop PC for $1,000 with a Mac Mini at only $600. That's pretty crazy. Okay, sticking with Nintendo systems here, let's go over to Nintendo Switch. Now, a couple things here, I'm using it in docked mode, but I'm also seeing a little bit of screen tearing as I'm playing. I'm not really sure if this has to do with the emulation or the capture card that I'm using, and so because of that, what I did instead is take it out of full screen mode and went into windowed mode. This is going to eliminate the screen tearing, but then also have the added bonus of being able to see the frames per second here on the bottom. And so for the rest of my Nintendo Switch emulation, I am going to use it in windowed mode like this. Either way, what I found when it came to Nintendo Switch emulation is that it was very, very good. It would give me some slowdown here and there just because of the shader compilation that was happening, but again, same story here, the longer I played a game, the better it played. And so for games like Super Mario Odyssey, one of the hardest games to emulate, this one actually did really well. And of course, when it comes to lightweight games, things like Celeste, yeah, this one obviously plays well too. Some games actually played so well that you could upscale them. So for example, Kirby and the Forgotten Land is actually running at a 2x docked resolution right here. And I'm getting a pretty solid 30 frames per second here, other than a stutter here and there when there's a new shader compilation. But I did find for the most part, I preferred to play these games in a 1x resolution, it just gave me a more stable 60 frames per second. Either way, aside from the shader compilation that would happen here and there as you start to play a game for the first time, I would say the M2 Mac Mini is very capable of doing Nintendo Switch emulation as well. The biggest drawback here is going to be compatibility. After all, Nintendo Switch emulation is an ongoing process. And so some newer games, for example Metroid Prime Remastered, may have some graphical issues. For this game, my character was basically a solid black. And yeah, it did look a little bit unnatural, but I think this is just a compatibility issue. I also found that the game would crash on me here and there as well. So my recommendation here would be to check the compatibility list within the Ryujinx website to see which games are going to work the best. Either way, I was still very impressed with Nintendo Switch emulation on the Mac Mini. Okay, next up, let's move over to the Sony systems. We'll start with PlayStation 2. Now, performance here was a little bit hit and miss depending on the game. For example, with Grand Theft Auto 3 or Ratchet & Clank, I could play these at a 6x resolution or 4K and absolutely no problem here. In fact, these games played really, really well. For other games, I would get some random slowdown that didn't make a lot of sense to me. When playing Jak and Daxter, I used it at a 3x resolution or 1080p, but I would still get slowdown in certain parts. And it wasn't a huge amount, but the strange thing was that if I upscaled it to a 6x resolution or 4K instead, I got the exact same amount of slowdown. And so for me, that means that it's not a Mac Mini performance issue, but really just a compatibility or optimization issue with the emulator. Another example is God of War. If I played it at 1080p or 720p or even the native resolution of 480p, the performance here was the same across the board. Now there are a couple tricks you can do to try to smooth out things. For example, here with Sly Cooper, trying to play it at a 3x resolution or 1080p is super slow. But if you go into the quick menu, you can change it from the Vulkan renderer right here over to the software renderer. This is going to more heavily tax the CPU, but again, the CPU can kind of do wonders. And so as you can see here, it is playing at full speed now like this. Just bear in mind that a software renderer cannot go beyond a 1x resolution. And so yes, for the most part, you can play every PS2 game, but there are going to be some weird ones here and there, and so you may have to drop over to software rendering instead. Either way, I would say that for PlayStation 2, it's not quite a plug-and-play experience like it is with GameCube. But the bright spot here is that PlayStation 3 emulation actually works really well. And so if there's a remastered version of a PS2 game, I would recommend playing it on this one instead. For example, as you can see here with God of War 2 Remastered, it's running absolutely fine. In fact, I found that as a whole, PlayStation 3 emulation was actually one of the best here on this Mac Mini altogether. No matter what game I tried, it always played at full speed, and this could be basically anything, a 3D game, a 2D game, driving games, all these played really well. And so for this system in particular, I'm very comfortable in saying that PlayStation 3, yes, works really well, it's just going to come down to compatibility with the emulator itself. But if it's going to be able to play on the PS3 emulator, it'll play on the Mac Mini. One of the most challenging test games that I always try is Ratchet & Clank Quest for Booty. And as you can see here, it's running very smoothly. And so yes, I would say PlayStation 3 emulation is knocked out of the park here with the Mac Mini. Okay, and finally, the last emulated system is going to be the original Xbox. Here I'm running it at a 2x resolution with the XEMU emulator. And some games do work pretty well. For example, Soul Calibur 2 is mostly consistent with 60 frames per second. So this game I would say is highly playable. Same thing with the first Halo. This one would dip down below the typical 30 frames per second, but even then the slowdown was just kind of normal for me and just the way that I used to play this on the Xbox. So I would say that this one is still also very playable for me. However, other games did not play well. For example, Dead or Alive 3 just struggled even to get at full speed. This is a game I would not consider to be playable. So much like how it is on Windows, I would say that the original Xbox emulation here is kind of hit and miss. Okay, now that we've gone through the testing of all these various emulators, let's talk a little bit about how you could clean up that experience if you wanted. And for this, we're going to talk about Emulation Station Desktop Edition. Now this app is available on multiple platforms, including Windows and Linux. And thankfully, they have a native Mac option right here for the ARM-based chips like the M2 that we're using in the Mac Mini. So all we have to do is just download and install this app, and then when you first open it up, it's going to give you this prompt right here. Essentially, what it wants to do is either find a ROM directory you've already made or create a directory for you. Just to keep it simple, I'm going to choose Create Directories. From there, it's going to make a bunch of different folders, and within them, you can put all of your game files. So let me go ahead and show you how to do that really quick. You're going to go into your root folder of your Mac, and within there, you'll find a ROMs folder. Inside there, you'll find all the pre-populated folders, and inside of that, you'll find a systeminfo.txt file. And that file is going to show you all the different supported file systems, so you can see specifically what games you can drop in. And it's also going to tell you what the default emulator is going to be within Emulation Station. So what you want to do here is just drag and drop all of your ROMs into the folders that they've made right here for you. After that, all you have to do is just open up Emulation Station again, and it's going to find all those games and then populate it here within the main menu. And I've only added a couple games here just because I'm testing it out, but as you can see, yeah, I have a bunch of games loaded up. And the cool thing is here, if you've already installed all your emulators, it's going to know that, and it's going to actually open up them when you try it. So for example, when starting up a Game Boy Advance game, as you can see, it's starting up RetroArch and it's working just fine. I did find a couple bugs here and there. For example, the dock would show up sometimes when I was launching RetroArch. But if you go into the Emulation Station Starter Guide, it'll actually walk you through how to fix some of these nuances. Now, getting this all set up might take a little bit of time. For example, the default emulator might not be the one that you prefer. And so what you'll have to do is go into these settings and adjust the alternative emulators, things like that. Either way, once you do have it set up with the hotkeys within each of the emulators to be able to close it out with your controller, it's kind of nice to be able to jump into your games by navigating the folder like this and not having to deal with a keyboard and mouse at all. In fact, after having this all set up, I went one step further, and that is I wanted to treat this like a standalone gaming console. And I'll have a little bit more info about this in my written guide down below, but essentially what I did is I turned off all of my login options for when I first start up the device, and then set it to start up Emulation Station when I turn the device on. So all I have right here is the Mac Mini hooked up with Ethernet, HDMI, as well as the power cable, and I can just go ahead and push the power button on the back, it'll start up the machine, and then immediately start up Emulation Station. From there, I just have to turn on my controller and then I'm immediately navigating through the menu. I've also gone ahead and scraped all the media art so everything looks nice and pretty. And because I have all the emulators configured, I can now go in and start up a game and it's going to go right into it. From there, if I want to close out of a game, I have it set up in my hotkeys to press select and start to quit RetroArch. And that's going to bring me back to the Emulation Station menu. Now I was still getting the dock here on the bottom, but I found out that if you press the Xbox button, what it'll do is actually bring up a bunch of different game apps. And from there you can just select Emulation Station and it'll get rid of that dock. Now, admittedly, this probably wasn't the smoothest process in the world. There were many times where I had to grab a keyboard and mouse just to kind of get out of a menu in case I couldn't do it with the controller. And so I don't want to give any illusions that this is going to be a hassle-free kind of gaming console. You have to remember that we're using a series of different emulators that are stacked on top of each other. And when you're using a bunch of different random apps that are not meant to work together like this, there's always going to be a bug here or there. However, as long as you're good with grabbing a keyboard and mouse from time to time in case you get stuck in a menu, this can be a really fun experience. And given the fact that we can emulate all the way up to Nintendo Switch is kind of amazing. In fact, if you look at my mini PC spreadsheet, you can see that the Apple is kind of in the middle right here at the $599 price point, but you can also see that these scores right here are far and away better than anything else in this price range. In fact, to get similar performance, you will probably have to spend quite a bit more money on a Windows PC. And if you're curious about using macOS for other things, for example with video playback or using it as a Plex server, or in my case for video editing or just daily tasks, then this might be a good fit for that as well. Regardless, if we're strictly talking about game emulation, I do think that the M2 Mac Mini right here is a really solid deal. There are going to be some concessions here and there. For example, it doesn't have an Xbox 360 emulator, and same thing with Nintendo 3DS. But with all those other systems, with the exception of the PlayStation 2, these seem to work exceptionally well for the price point. And the cool thing here is that all of these gains have happened over the past year or two, so I'm even more excited to see what it's going to look like a year or two from now. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Are you in the market for a Mac, and does this kind of help push you over the edge? Or are you a current Mac user and you never really thought about using it for gaming like me? Either way, I was very surprised to see how good the performance was on this new Mac Mini, and I think at a $599 price point, as long as you're okay with working with Mac OS, it's kind of a slam dunk when it comes to retro game emulation. Either way, I'd love to hear what you think about it in the comments below. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.